To another discussion of the great ideas. Today, we conclude our consideration of learning by facing the problem of whether and how we can learn from television. As you will observe, the scene has changed. Mr. Luckman is not here, as he usually is, to ask me questions. I'm not sitting at my desk, surrounded by books. I'm here with a television set, a chair, sit-in, and some notes to be sure that I remember all the points I want to touch on in this discussion. These changes are occasioned by the special character and what may even be the novelty of the subject we're going to deal with. I'd like to feel, I'd like you to feel, that we're sitting together in a room watching a television set as we discuss whether and how we can learn from television. Now you may ask, what is so special about this subject? Let me see if I can tell you. When we considered learning from books or learning from discussion, we didn't ask whether we could learn from books, learn by reading, or learn by discussing. We only asked how we could learn from books, how to read them, or how we could learn by discussion. But today, we have to ask the question whether we can learn from television before we can consider how to learn from television. Now, you still may be puzzled by that. You may say, why? Why whether? Why should that question come first? And I think I could reinforce your puzzlement by giving you good reason for supposing that there is no doubt that people can learn from television, no doubt that television is an instrument of teaching and learning. But then, I would like to go on after doing that to tell you the difficulties that must be overcome if television really is to work as an educational instrument. In other words, what I want to do first is to present the case for television as a medium of education, then the difficulties or case against television, and finally, supposing the difficulties can be overcome, I would like then, in conclusion, to talk about how we can learn from television. Let me start at once by talking about giving you the case for television as a medium of education. It certainly is the case, and we know it to be the case, that every improvement in the means of communication, almost on the face of it, becomes an advance or improvement in the methods of teaching and learning. We know this clearly in the case of printing. Not only did the invention of printing and cheap printing cause a revolution in political communication, it caused an extraordinary transformation in education as well. And in our own time, we have seen this happen in the case of radio. Radio has tremendous power as a means of communication. Certainly this is clear on the political level. Just think of how Churchill and Roosevelt used radio as a means of communication in times of crisis. Now then, television more than doubles the power of radio, and so we should expect that it has more than twice the potentialities for education that radio has. Certainly it is the case that pictures and words have more power because they simulate the living presence of persons and actions. This is clear to all of us on the level of political or social communication. Just think for a moment of what television did for us in reporting the national conventions 2 or 3 years ago. Better than that, let's look at what they did for us.
The delegate from Minnesota, Mr. Berger. Mr. Chairman, Minnesota wishes to change its vote to Eisenhower.
Then think of what it did for us during the campaign itself, when it brought the debate of issues, the campaign speeches right into our own living room. Finally, at the end of the election, it took us all, did it not, to the scene, right to the scene of the inauguration of a new president. As here.
So we who are free must proclaim anew our faith. This faith is the abiding creed of our fathers.
Now,
It is our faith in
it is a perfectly fair inference, is it not, from the manifest power of television as a means of social or political communication to an estimate of its tremendous power or its potentialities for educational use. Let's examine for a moment what those potentialities are. And I speak of them as potentialities because, in my judgment, they are still almost entirely latent. They have not been exploited by far. First of all, is it not obvious that television extends the power of teachers? That through television, they can reach a much larger audience than teachers could ever have dreamed of reaching. But that is superficial compared to the next point, for what is much more important is that television intensifies the power of the teacher. Teaching on television is more effective than the actual presence of the teacher in the classroom or the lecturer in the lecture hall. Now, I admit this is paradoxical. It might seem strange at first, but I think it can be explained. My own experience, by the way, in my own experience, I've done a great deal, many years of popular lecturing, and only recently been teaching on television. But I think from my own experience, I can tell why this is so. For one thing, the intimacy and power of the close-up. It brings the speaker very close to the listener. And then, for another thing, television communication is person-to-person communication. When I talk to you on television, I'm talking just to you, alone. Whereas if I teach in a classroom or lecture in a lecture hall, I'm talking to 200 or 50 or 1,000 persons, at none of whom I'm looking and none of whom I can direct myself individually to. It is extraordinary that television personalizes communication. Now, in view of all this, certainly you have every right to ask, why then does one ever ask the question whether one can learn from television? It would seem perfectly obvious that television is a great instrument of learning. To answer that question, let me now tell you briefly the difficulties that must be overcome. There are two difficulties. Let me begin with the first. The first difficulty, I think, involves the attitude of the producer, the persons who control the medium, the television medium, the persons who prepare the programs. The question is, will those who create the programs on television give the public materials of genuine, intrinsic educational worth? The answer to that question depends upon two things. First of all, it depends on how much the producers succumb to the very prevalent tendency to underestimate the average human intelligence. This, by the way, is a great American failing, not only among those who control our mass media of communication, but even in our public school system. Now, the second error, which may prevent television from being used well educationally, is a deep misconception of learning itself. The childish notion that everything must be fun, or else people will have none of it. This reduces everything to the lowest level of entertainment. Now, I don't mean that education or learning cannot be entertaining. In fact, it can be, it must be, because the basic meaning of to entertain is to hold the attention of. And no one can teach anybody anything if he doesn't succeed in entertaining him in this sense of holding his attention. But to understand education or learning as entertaining in this sense certainly does not mean that it must be painless or effortless. In fact, painless or effortless learning is a contradiction in terms. Hence, in my view, the producers must risk asking their audiences to make some effort and to take some pains. Otherwise, they are not offering their audiences a genuine invitation to learning. Let's look at the current offering. Let's see what is being offered in educational television and ask whether it is as good as it might be. I have here I have here some catalogs of what are called public service programs on our television today. And I should like just to do a quick inventory of what we are given, of our current fare. For example, I think there's no question, if one looks through this offering, that one finds that much progress has been made in presenting good literature on the television screen. We now can see the great plays of Shakespeare. We can see a dramatized version of the story of Don Quixote. See the plays of Eugene O'Neill, the Pulitzer Prize plays. And another thing that television does for us is to bring us good music, and bring it to us in an extraordinary way, because the television camera actually enables us to hear the music better by focusing on the instruments that are playing, particularly in orchestral music. For example, let's look at this now. The same thing is true of painting. For with the help of the camera, our eye can be taken by the camera itself to look at the painting, explore it, see it analytically in a manner that makes television an extraordinarily good instrument for teaching us how to look at painting. And here, let me show you in a moment, a film that explores the paintings of Walter Sickert that does exactly this for us.
In this picture, Sickert's detachment and irony is complete. The mood of daydream and boredom in a back room.
And can you imagine how powerful this instrument will be when we have color television that will be able to bring us in their true colors the pictures of the great masters? Finally, in this field, we have current events, political reporting, political commentary. Commentary of the sort, reporting of the sort, which, in my judgment, is done best by a man like Ed Murrow in a program like See It Now, though there are many others like it, perhaps not as good. Now, looking at all this part of the offering, one must say that educationally speaking, this is more on the level of reading for information than reading for enlightenment. It is good, but not good enough. It is not enough. It is important for the American public, particularly in the field of political current events, to be well informed. But they must be more than well informed. They must be able to think critically about public affairs. They must be able, knowing the facts, to evaluate and interpret them. For this purpose, there is some need for them to have an acquaintance with basic principles, with fundamental issues, and the ideas on all sides of the question that illuminate those issues. Here, in this case, I think we come to teaching television or educational television in the strictest sense of the word. Now, such educational television, which strictly is teaching, occupies a very small part of the total time devoted to public service programs on the television screen. Much more than 2/3 or 3/4 of it, of the time is devoted to programs of the sort I have just been talking of. And if we examine this small portion devoted to what is strictly educational television, what do we find? I have here another catalog which gives a list of such programs. And I'm going to just categorize them generally. As I look through this, I find that they fall into 2 or 3 main categories. First of all, and perhaps most numerously, are popular expositions of history, or natural science, or the social sciences, mainly or primarily intended to be informative. For example, such an excellent program as Science in Action. Let's look at a piece from it.
And now, as I agitate this fellow and put the 2 electrodes down here, we should see an indication on the needle swinging over is putting out quite a charge.
Or, if we turn from the natural sciences to the social sciences, another excellent program on this level, a program dealing with the history and character of American political parties. Let's look at a scene from this.
Will meet together, they have similar attitudes, and they have certain objectives. They want to study public affairs, and they want to perhaps reform local government.
Then there are a few programs like Professor Baxter's, which deal with great literature and with the lessons that such literature teaches. And finally, there are a few programs like the program of Professor Irving Lee on men and ideas, or my own program on the great ideas which are philosophical. Philosophical in that basic sense in which philosophy is everybody's business. Philosophical in the sense that it deals with the consideration of ideas that everyone must face, or the facing of issues that everyone must try to solve. Now then, let's turn to the second difficulty. Let's turn to the second difficulty in the way of the effective use of television as a means of teaching or as a means of education. Suppose I say the first difficulty is solved. Suppose the producers do give us a sufficient number of programs of genuine educational work. There is still the difficulty at the other end, on the other side of the screen, on the side where you sit looking at the television screen. And this difficulty has two causes, one of which is not your fault or anybody's fault, and one of which you may be able to do something about. The one which is not your fault is simply this. This television set is in your living room. You come to it in hours after work for pleasure and for relaxation, and hours of weariness when you deserve relaxation. The whole atmosphere in which you approach this set, I think, militates against the use of television as an invitation to the pain of learning. Now, perhaps you can do something about this. Perhaps you can plan to set some few hours a week aside for the intentional use of the instrument as a means of education. But in my judgment, it will always be difficult for you to overcome, for any of us to overcome, the soft seductions of the atmosphere in which we sit down to look at television. Now, the other part of the difficulty is one which you can do something about. Let's suppose for a moment that you do make plans, that you do definitely plan to set some time apart in which you are going to use the instrument for educational purposes. Then the question is, will you make the effort? Will you take the pains that are requisite for learning? You will recall that through this whole series of discussions of learning, I have kept emphasizing one thing over and over and over. There is no learning without activity on the part of the learner. I made this point when I said that only by active reading, not by passive reading, can we learn. I made this point when I said that we can learn much more by actively participating in discussion than by passively listening to a lecture. Well, the same thing is true of television. We can only learn from television if we are active. And so that brings us to what is really the $64 question. How do we learn from television? What sort of activity, what sort of work must we do if we are going to make television an effective instrument of teaching for ourselves? Let me see if I can answer that question. What in general is the activity that must be involved when we are learning from television? My answer to that question in general is that the activity must be the same here as elsewhere. The activity known as thinking. Not just remembering. Not just passive listening. Thinking. So let me see if I make the point another way. When you watch a play actively, you must experience empathy. You must feel yourself in to the emotions and thought and actions of the characters. Well, something like that's needed here. Something I almost call intellectual empathy. When you watch thinking going on there on the screen, you must try to think with the thinking that is going on. Now, my second point has to do with what you can do in particular. What can you do in particular to be active in learning from television? Three things, I think. First of all, it seems to me that watching a television program that is educational should be supplemented by reading. By reading the books mentioned, by reading the books recommended, or the books that may be read from or quoted from, or even perhaps, in some cases, reading the script of the show itself. I remember in certain educational radio shows, like the round table, the script was published, and many people bought the script and read it. That could be done in television, too. You know, I watched Professor Baxter in his talk about Shakespeare, and he's continually telling his audience to go and read the plays of Shakespeare. For unless they go and read the plays for themselves, they can't really understand the plays or learn about them sufficiently merely by listening to Professor Baxter. And I do the same thing. I continually refer to books and recommend them. For example, I'm going to show you in a moment the opening program in the series of programs on love, in which I began by recommending some books that should be read on this great subject. Let's look at this. The same thing is true of love, the theory of love. I think the great books show this extremely significantly. As a matter of fact, the great books are quite wonderful on the subject of love. I'd like to pause for a moment just to tell you something about them. I have here this topic on a list of the books about love, the long list, and I would simply like to read the titles of a few of the books throughout the centuries that are distinguished. The second point is that just as in active reading, you must make notes or mark a book, so you must do something very much like that in actively watching a television program that is educational. Let me illustrate what I mean by watching with you parts of one of my own programs on knowledge and opinion. Here, in the opening, I start out by asking some questions. Our understanding of the difference between knowing and opining. There are a number of questions we ought to answer, or to consider at least. First, what sort of objects are the objects of knowledge? Can we have knowledge about, as opposed to the objects about which we can only have opinion? Second, what is the psychological difference between knowing and opining as acts of the mind? Third, can we have knowledge and opinion about one and the same thing? And finally, a fourth question, what is the scope of knowledge? How much knowledge do we really have? And as opposed to the kinds of things about which we can only have opinion. What is the limit or scope of opinion in the things of our mind? Now, these are the questions we're going to try to answer as we proceed today. There's one more. You should have noted these questions in order to see whether later I got around to answering all of them. For example, you should spot the following passage in which, to see whether or not you detect that I'm answering the second question, the question about the difference, the psychological difference between knowledge and opinion. Look. A statement expresses knowledge when our assent to it is involuntary, when our assent to it is compelled or necessitated by the object we are thinking about, as in the case of 2 plus 2 equals 4. But a statement expresses opinion, not knowledge, when our assent to it is voluntary, when the object leaves us quite free to make up our own minds to think this way or that way about the object, to think about the object exactly as we please. And usually, in the case of opinion, what makes up our mind, one way or the other, is not the thing we're thinking about, but our emotions, our desires, our interests, or some authority upon which we are relying. In the third place, the third thing you must do is challenge what the speaker says. If I'm the speaker, you must ask me questions. For example, earlier in this opinion program, I said... When I say that ignorance is more like knowledge than error is, some of you may think it's a shocking mistake to suppose so. But though this may seem paradoxical, I think I can explain to you why it is so. Any teacher will tell you that it's much easier to teach a student who is ignorant than one who is in error. Because the student who is in error on a given point thinks that he knows, whereas in fact he does not know. The student who is ignorant is in a much better condition to learn. It is almost necessary to take the student who is in error and first correct the error before you can teach him. I think that's the meaning of saying that error is further away from knowledge than ignorance is. The path from ignorance to knowledge is a shorter path than the path from error to knowledge, because if a person is error, you must first get rid of the error and reduce him to ignorance before you can start teaching. And then later, I tried to demonstrate how what we can correct simple errors of perception when they are due to perceptual illusions. Now, this is what I said.
What is the answer to the skeptic? Let me begin. I've stated the skeptic's position. Let me now give the answer to the skeptic. First of all, most important of all, the answer to the skeptic on the matter of perceptual illusions. How do we know? How do we know they are illusions? If we know there are illusions, we can only know it because some sense perception we regard as accurate. If we could not have some verified or clear and acceptable perception, we couldn't know these were illusions. Let me show you that. Let me take the last of these perceptual illusions and put this ruler down. And as I put the ruler down, I see that that's 12¼ inches, and I put it down here again and see that it's 12¼ inches. If this perception were not knowledge, I couldn't call that an illusion. If this perception were an illusion, I couldn't know that was an illusion. Hence, to even discover that there are perceptual illusions, I have to know my perception.
Doesn't that contradict what I said before? One viewer of that program wrote me a letter asking me whether I hadn't just contradicted myself. He was watching actively, thinking, asking questions as he should. Now, finally, and most important of all, is discussion. Discussion by persons who are viewing or have just viewed the same program. We have discovered that reading the great books is not enough. Adults who read them must, after reading them, get together and discuss them. This is just as necessary. It can be just as well done, in fact, perhaps even more easily done in the case of educational television. I know an experiment being performed right now in the Oakland Public Library, where a group of adults come and sit in the library and watch a television program as it goes on the air, and then after it is over, carry on immediately a discussion of that program. And I often try to end one of my programs with some questions left unanswered in order to provoke discussion that should begin when the program is over. Here, for example, at the very end of the programs on love, I try to leave you with just such unanswered questions.
Are connected with the main themes of today's discussion. For example, think of the problem of the conflict or relation between romantic love and conjugal or married love. In a sense, conjugal or married love is the very opposite of romantic love. Marriage, in my understanding of it at least, is the death of romance and should be the death of romance. Why? Why? Because romantic love cannot be long sustained. Certainly not with the familiarity and the propinquity of married life, and certainly not with the demands it makes for the loss of on approach. Moreover, romantic love thrives on seeking but not achieving, on pursuit but not possession. Romantic love thrives on being unrequited, whereas married or conjugal love brings requital, possession, union. Hence, it is the end, not the continuation. It is the end, not the continuation of romantic love. And when anyone thinks that romantic love is the true love and persists in that illusion can be the ruin of marriage.
This concludes our discussion of the great idea of learning. Next time, we shall begin the discussion of another great idea. I hope you'll be with us in a mood and with a will to learn from television. Thank you very much.